Hi, this is Jocelyn with DEI Changemakers with the Mix and Titanium Industry Pioneers. And I am so excited to be joined here today by Maki Hsieh, the CEO of the Asian Hall of Fame. Maki, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, Jocelyn. I'm so happy to be here with you today.
Absolutely. And we have a lot to dive into, but I want to start by just learning a bit about your journey and how you got to be where you are today.
Well, I'm so happy to share because my journey is pretty incredible. It's very global in scope, and I think it would help a lot of folks understand how important cultural intelligence is to our success. So, I was raised as an American citizen in Asia. I grew up in Tokyo and I grew up in Taipei. My mother first came to the United States in the 50s, and she got her bachelor's, she got her master's, opened a candy store in Little Tokyo and San Francisco. And then when she met my dad, she went back to Asia. So my younger sister and I were born as Americans in Asia. And during that time, we experienced all the respect that Americans received. We went to the American school. We played on the American Little League. We went to the American grocery store. We're part of the American club where we had access to the swimming pool and the tennis league. And we were part of the American community. Regardless of your race, regardless of your ethnicity, whether you were Japanese, Chinese, Black, Hispanic, if you're American, and you were put in a very elevated place. So I thought I was ready to come back to the mainland, come back to America. So I went to boarding school in Massachusetts. When I was 15 years old, I came by myself with my two suitcases. And I was not treated as an American. I was seen as foreigner, even though I was more American than the lacrosse playing blonde, blue-eyed girls in school. I was placed in a diversity dorm. I was asked to parade in the international parade with my chi pao, my Chinese dress. I was co-chair of the Asian Society just because there really wasn't any other support system. And I made friends with the African Latino American Club, the AFLAT-AM at Andover. But I didn't really see that Asians were accepted as Americans. They were seen as foreign. Then I went to Johns Hopkins because I felt that I really wanted to explore what it meant to contribute to a global system. Like healthcare and medicine is a very big part of the Asian community in general. So I went to Johns Hopkins, and again, I saw that Ivy League students, 25% of us were Asian, and yet only 5% make it to the Fortune 500 CEO status. C-suites is only 6% Asian. 47% of the American tech workforce are Asian, and yet only 4% rise up to the top of any tech company. Most of them are Indian because they're coming from India with the technological skills that the tech companies need. So looking at this kind of inequity, it made me feel that I wanted to learn a little bit more about how to break the wheel, how to break the system, what it took to change the language of diversity, what it took to change the landscape of equity. So I went into industries that were predominantly non-Asian and male-oriented. The first industry I went into was investment banking. I followed my father's footsteps. He started a mezzanine finance company. He was the first Chinese banker to start a Chinese-owned bank in Tokyo. So I thought, okay, I'm going to go into banking. I'm going to go into the most difficult place possible, which is mergers and acquisitions. I'm going to start there because how hard could it be? It's all about numbers. Isn't it about making money? So I joined banking, and I discovered that out of 126 financial analysts who were all recruited from Harvard and Wharton and Stanford, there were 6 of us were women. One, Andrew Kamise from Japan, and he graduated from Yale. And then there was me, and there were just 2 Asians. There was one black analyst from Harvard. So within 2 months, 2 women left. So now there were 4 women out of 100. I mean, it was incredible to see that the inequity was not only against Asians and against diversity, but also against women, which in my cocoon world, I didn't realize existed. There was this inequity against women as well. I then moved into went into corporate finance. And that was very interesting because now I'm seeing that American companies are heavily dependent on global consumers, global buyers for their profit margins, and yet their executives are not diverse. Their executives are not reflecting the consumers they serve. I'm beginning to see that the shareholders are not diverse. They're predominantly white male. The shareholders and the board are not reflecting the diversity of the communities they serve. My mother with her 2 master's PhD and a maverick as the only Japanese woman tenured professor in Taiwan, taught me about global literacy, but I saw that these global corporations did not have a lot of cultural intelligence. They didn't understand that, for example, when I worked at Disney, that we're selling Disneyland and the concept of Mickey Mouse to Shanghai, but there are certain things that you have to be aware when you're selling to an Asian consumer. Like they really didn't know. They really didn't even research. And it's not just about Asians. It's also about other global partners. For example, when Disney opened Paris Disneyland, we had a huge problem because Disney, the company, did not allow the sale of alcohol on any of the Disneyland resorts. And of course, as you and I know, just as consumers, that wine is huge for Parisians. You cannot have anything without wine for Parisians. So that took years to reverse. So that's just one example of global literacy in Europe. When you're looking at Hong Kong Disneyland, Tokyo Disneyland, now Shanghai Disneyland, I was part of that opening, and also part of the opening of a lot of great Disney assets. I realized more and more in media and entertainment that although Americans were selling to a global consumer, the executives were not reflecting the diversity of the communities we're serving, and the media was not reflecting the diversity of the consumers that were enjoying the product. So you're not seeing Asians celebrated on television, in movies, in music. If they are celebrated, they're usually foreign. So they're speaking Korean or it's Korean content. They're not produced here. And it was very interesting to see when I started in media and entertainment 10 years ago, throughout my 30-year career in finance, banking, and entertainment, that there's this list that comes out every year. It's called the 100 top most powerful women in Hollywood. And when I first started, there was only one Asian woman on there. Wow. So out of 100 women, one, Andrea Wong, she started at Disney, then she became president of Lifetime. Now she's the head of Sony International. There's only one. And then there's Oprah Winfrey. So there's a Black lady there. There really isn't a lot of diversity, even with women. So I think that made me see that the greatest impact that we can offer as diversity executives and as Asian female executives and women in general is to go into areas where there are not a lot of us. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of areas where there are not a lot of us, and really shine the light and be that beacon and be that lighthouse to say, hey, there's power in diversity. And that's another thing that I really took away from when I was a kid, was that diversity is a very powerful tool. It's a very powerful language. That global literacy and cultural intelligence has a lot of power versus, for example, China. And I just got off of a forum with Colonel Tom Hobbs and also Major General Tony Taguba. Both of them are amazing leaders in the military. But they were saying how, for example, China, we now have a lot of conflict and tension between US and China, but China is predominantly homogenous, predominantly all Chinese with a lot of ethnic groups within China, but they don't celebrate their diversity. They don't understand that diversity can be leveraged as power. Whereas because of my background and where I've been in my career, I know that diversity is power. And if we leverage it correctly, we can actually create safe spaces and create more collaboration rather than the division that we're seeing today.
And I think that that's such an important point. And you raise a very interesting question, right, of like infiltrating these spaces where we can have impact. And there's this very fine line, or not line that we have to juggle, but situations where we are put in, where on one hand, we're bringing this beacon of diversity, but then there's also this layer or aspect of tokenism that can also be put on you. So how do you kind of navigate that line?
Andrea Nui, who is one of our inductees, when she was interviewed about Asian Hall of Fame, she said all she wanted to do for her entire career was just to get a seat at the table. That was her number one focus, is just to get a seat at the table. And it doesn't matter what table it is, how she got there. As long as she had a seat at the table, it was a good start. Tokenism to me means that you're placing somebody in a situation because you need to check a checkbox and not because of the character of the individual, the abilities of the individual. I believe that if the character and the abilities, the qualities of the individual brings confidence to the group, brings an elevated prestige, and also increases the P&L, then we might want to change that word tokenism to something else. We might want to change it. I think representation is not a strong enough word either, but we might want to replace that word with ambassadorship, that there is a cultural ambassador on that team. I think that's in the last 10 years, whenever we had a diversity, equity, and inclusion officer in a company, it's been a token Black woman. Because you check Black and you check female, then you're done. So a lot of DEI officers are token Black women. And they haven't been given the funding, they haven't been given the support, they haven't been invited to the table. And now with the entire Me Too movement, Black Lives Matter movement, Stop Asian Hate movement, all of this together, and the Latinx movement, all of this culminating is now giving DEI officers and companies more voice, more funding, more recognition, and a seat at the C-suite table. They're seen as very important players in determining corporate policy, institutional governance, and determining what leadership looks like in America. So I think the word ambassadorship is really key. Cultural ambassadorship or cultural intelligence is really important. And as we move out of the 80s and the 90s idea of tokenism into ambassadorship, that's going to really give all of us a lot more power and amplify our voices.
I love that. Thank you so much. And, we kind of skipped ahead, but I had to ask that question. But I want to know kind of what was that moment where you decided, all right, I want to make a transition in my career and do something different and really dedicate my time, energy, and effort into developing and growing the Asian Hall of Fame?
This is a very personal question because up until that point, I've been very busy doing the corporate thing. I'm also a performing artist who was discovered on America's Got Talent, and I was performing with Skrillex at EDC, and I'm a EDM violinist, and I was just having a grand old time. And equity inclusion really was not on my radar. I thought, just like everyone else, if you succeeded, had the degrees, worked hard, everything was going to be fine. And then my sister passed away. My sister passed away in a really freak accident. She slipped, fell, hit her head, and 3 days later she passed away of a brain stroke. And that really woke me up because suddenly I was the only child, and suddenly I had to shepherd my mother. She started going into the psychosis and dementia, and she was a mess. And suddenly I had a bit of a crisis myself, and I thought, what am I doing with my talent? What am I doing with all of this knowledge and wisdom? Yes, but networks and information that I have that I can contribute to civilization, to humanity, to the betterment of the community. What can I do more, right? In honor of her. Sorry. So then I did an about face, and then I went to management because I was an artist at that time, and I was also the head of a performing arts center. And I said, you know what I really like to do? I really like to take my performances and donate it to charity. And they said, well, you're already a UNICEF ambassador, you're donating concerts to UNICEF. I said, yes, but that's a really global platform. Can we take that global platform and localize it to these communities and have concerts where we're raising money for local charities? And they said, well, we'll 100% support it. It's going to make no money for me or no money for them, no money for the cause, but it's going to really donate to the cause and raise awareness. And with that kind of work, I caught the attention of California State Senate Susan Rubio, who also attended the Lunar New Year Festival that I had put together for the community. And I was honored as a California Woman of the Year in 2019. And when the California State Senate flew me up to Sacramento, I saw that, what I did with my talent and my energy and my focus really did make a difference. At that time, Karen Wong, they called me from Seattle and said, listen, we have this thing called the Asian Hall of Fame. It was established 16 years ago, but it's a small dinner party that's become bigger and bigger and bigger. We now have Christy Yamaguchi, Connie Chung, Bruce Lee, all these people. And we would like to make a statement about equity, advocacy, justice. How do we transition a brand that's a local brand and a party to something that has a national significance and can really move the needle on justice? So I took up the challenge, and I think ever since then we've really pivoted the message from, yes, glamour, sequins, celebrities, great, we love them. Let's galvanize them for good, and let's really move the needle on justice.
That's an incredible, and thank you for sharing your story.
Yeah, I know. I'm sorry. I was
don't apologize. Thank you so much for sharing your story.
Oh.
And I think it really shows, right, how life can change, not just for us, but for others when we operate out of a place of passion, when we pursue purpose, and not just a purpose that we can see for the day, but for the greater good and for our lives, even when we don't, know if it's going to make any money and it's like
Yes.
different from like anything that we've done. But when you're operating in those spaces, in these areas where there's not a clear path forward necessarily, but there's a grit and a willingness, right? All of the changes that you can make, and you've done so much, not just with the Asian Hall of Fame, but across the board. And, you really sit at the intersection of lots of aspects of diversity, right? We've talked about how you're a woman, you're a member of the AAPI community. How has viewing the world from that lens really impacted your experience, either in the corporate world or now in the new role that you've taken on within the past few years?
From the lens of the AAPI community, I have to say, first of all, the AAPI community is very insular because that's the way the system has divided everyone. If the invaders who came into the shores of Asia 509 years ago could divide everybody, then there would be less uprisings. So the AAPI community is no different. It's like a nuclear fallout from 5 centuries of imperialism. AAPI always focused only on AAPI. They only focused on this issue or this cause or in their community in this city. There really wasn't a concerted effort for everyone to come together. Until Stop Asian Hate, there really wasn't. Actually, there was some competition because they knew that there was a limited number of people who could get into these jobs or could get into this college. So there was competition amongst the Asians. The model minority myth also increased competition and pit one group against the other. The other thing that the AAPI lens did was that it excluded AAPI from internationals. So they said, no, our experience is within our 28 million or 23 million Asians in America. It's totally different from the international Asians. We have nothing to do with them. They're totally separate from us. Whatever America has problems with Japan or Korea or China or India, it's nothing to do with us. So they are there, we are we. And a very similar parallel are the Jewish leaders in America who are Americans, have been here multi-generations, and they say, we have nothing to do with what's going on in Israel and Palestinians, and that's separate from us. So there's this idea that we can do it by ourselves. And I think what COVID has done is shown that we're all connected, like it or not. In global supply chain, we are all connected. You click buy on Amazon, you might not get that for 2 months. We're all connected, all right? And then what also Black Lives Matter and what Stop Asian Hate, the Me Too movement has shown is that we're stronger together. If we come together, we're going to have a majority voice at the global table. When Asians as a whole come together, and that's the first thing I did at Asian Hall of Fame, was I said, we have to include the international Asians. We have to include First Nations and indigenous tribes who have a very close DNA and culture with Asians. We have to include Asians who have special needs. We cannot say, oh, this is a pipeline to success. And by the way, if you're autistic or Asperger's or your disabilities with mobility, forget it. You don't qualify. You can't do that because it's a different pipeline for talent. So by increasing the advocacy from Asians, who are 5% of the voters in America, to now 60% of the world's population, you've suddenly amplified the voices. And if you include Africans, Hispanics, Blacks, if you include people of color, we're actually a majority and not a minority. And that's something that other people have said as well. But from the lens of where I stood, I've always been confident in that the global literacy has a lot to offer to the DEI story here in the United States. And by collaboration and reaching across the aisle, we're actually going to be able to move the needle. Now, that's easier said than done. There's a lot of problems with culture. Culture of Americans here, Asians here are very different from the culture of how customs and business is done there. Language is a problem, right? A lot of people who over there, they don't speak English. And so there's a language issue. But I believe that those logistical issues can be overcome if we take that first step, which is to recognize that we're stronger together.
We are so much stronger together. And you kind of just hit on this, but there are so many different expressions and experiences of not just diversity, but of the lack of understanding and prejudice that comes along with diversity sometimes. And so as a society, we are starting to learn, like you've iterated before, a lot more about systems of oppression, or, the way that different groups have navigated. And, being a Black woman, obviously slavery and systemic racism are very important to me. But there's also been colonization and oppression across various Asian countries, which I don't think that a lot of people know about. So can you tell us, as high level or as detailed as you'd like to get about that, and how it may sort of impact or manifest itself in Asian culture that we see today, keeping in mind that it is so diverse?
It is so diverse, and one of the things that two things. The first thing is about the power and diversity, right? So power and diversity is very important. There's a movement right now in the United States where everyone's talking about how it's better to just focus on one America, like one America, and it looks a certain way and it votes a certain way. This is one America, and that's the only America, and everybody else should just conform to that one America. So what I always say to that is, I always say it's kind of like football. Like if you say, I'm a football fan, and everybody will like, oh, great, what team? You can't say, no team, just football. No, what team? Are you a Ravens fan, Dallas Cowboy? Because that tells me a lot about you and whether I'm inviting you to dinner tonight, right? It's the same kind of thing, is that a Dallas Cowboy fan is going to have a different culture than a Ravens fan. Very different way of doing things than like a Packers fan or 49ers fan. And a lot of times you can't put them in the same room because there's a lot of issues going on between those football teams. It's the same kind of thing with Asian countries. It's the same kind of thing with nationalities and races. We have our own kind of culture within the group that makes it difficult for all of them to be in one room, unless you're in the United Nations. But I think that is a conversation that has to keep happening, is cultural ambassadorship, cultural literacy. But the way that I explain it is this, is my daughter, actually, my 13-year-old daughter was asking me about colonization. What does that mean? And I said, well, imagine if Ukraine was successful in conquering the United States. They invaded, they bombed our cities, they're now, I'm not Ukraine, Russia. Imagine if Russia came and bombed the United States and we are now Russians. Just like Russia is invading Ukraine, Russia has invaded the United States and we're no longer the United States of America. What does that mean? She said, well, it means I have to learn Russian. Yes. It means you don't have a job. That's right. Unless you learn Russian. That's right. If I know Russian, I have Russian friends, I'm going to keep my job. Now, Russia does not have an interest in completely destabilizing our economy. They're going to keep who? They're going to keep doctors, nurses, scientists, engineers. They're going to keep people who can help rebuild the economy for Mother Russia. They're also going to hire people from Russia to come to the United States. So if you're in music, acting, journalism, forget it. All Russians, they're replacing all of you. And if you're going into music, you should learn Russian ballet. You should do Russian violin. You should do Russian piano. You can't do the American way. Forget jazz, forget hip hop. There's no more pop music. There's no more R&B. There's no country music. It's all Russian music. So it's a similar situation. Imagine, for example, that you're going about your way, you're Malaysian, you're fine with your country, you've got a government, you've got a king and a queen, and suddenly Portugal's knocking on your door 3 times. Brutally, bloodily invading your country, and finally they come to your door. That happened 509 years ago. Portugal was the first one to come on the doors of Malaysia, and they conquered Puerto Malacca. They sold the Asian women into sex trafficking. They took the Muslim and sold them into slavery, and they took all the able-bodied Malays and Chinese and put them in labor camps to help rebuild the economy for Portugal. And one by one, every single Asian country fell. Only 3 sustained. 1, Korea, did not fall to a Western country, but it fell to Japan. Thailand never fell to a Western country because it gave up an island to be left alone. And the 3rd was Japan. They had a closed door policy. When they opened their doors and they saw everybody was colonized, they said, we're going to be the colonizer. We don't want to be colonized. So they became the colonizer. And that is why even today, what do you say to your kids? What do you say to your community? Keep your head down, learn French, learn English, only do the jobs where if you go to America, they must hire you. They must give you a visa. If you're a computer scientist, if you're an engineer, if you're a nuclear physicist, they will not hire you. If you are a singer, a Bollywood artist, they will not give you a visa. So it's the same thing that we say today. And it's the same thing that we emphasize is that, oh, if We are successful, and we have PhD, MDs, JDs, MBAs from Harvard, Princeton, Yale, Stanford. We have to be accepted. And if we have money, you have to invite us to your table. And we know that's not been true because racial relations and racial conflict has been the foundation of this country. So we've seen if you have money, you're not going to be invited to the all-white country club. If you have a lot of degrees, you might not be invited into that golf club that you want to be in because of the color of your skin. So one by one, because of this imperialism and the structure of inequity that already happened generations and centuries ago, we share a lot in common with our African brothers and sisters, with our Hispanic brothers and sisters who've also been colonized, also suffer from imperialism, and also have the same conversation of creating a safe space for diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Yeah. Oh, that was a lot, and it was powerful.
Right, because a lot of people are like, oh, mono-minority, it's bad, it's wrong, it's terrible, but they don't understand it ties in with Africans, Hispanics, and Indigenous, and that ties into centuries of oppression. A lot of Americans, there was one, I don't want to say his name, but he's the head of the American Bar Association, and he got a lot of criticism because he put out on LinkedIn that, hey, we need to advocate for the Blacks and Browns who've been oppressed through the centuries. Everyone's like, hey, wait a minute, how about the Jews? How about the Asians? We all share the same narrative, and that there's been already a structure of inequity. We're here to break the wheel.
And I think it also speaks to what you said, a few minutes back, where we're all sort of focused on this cause and not coming together really for the collective. And although our experiences may have different flavor, they're all very similar in kind. We have these months, right? Like right now we're in AAPI Heritage Month, and we had Black History Month, and we will have Pride Month next month. But how do we make these movements more than a moment in time?
I was just on a forum with Major General Tony Taguba. He was the first Filipino to be a Major General, 2-star general. And he said that at the White House reception for AAPI month, it was lovely, it was nice, he was at the lawn, he met a lot of friends that he hasn't seen for 5 years. But he said it's just one day. It's one day out of the whole year. And then, of course, it wasn't really publicized on any of the major news networks that this had happened. And the conversation echoed exactly what you asked, which was how do we integrate this so that it's part of people's lives? It's part of people's understanding. What's missing is cultural literacy in the schools. What's missing is cultural literacy in our communities. It is egregious that there is a major Japanese internment camp at the Santa Anita Park, which is a huge thoroughbred racetrack, but there is no plaque, there's no recognition. Nobody knows about it. Even the high school across from it didn't even know that it was a camp. So there's a lack of cultural literacy in our companies and our boardrooms. In the military, they were speaking specifically about the military, but the military is very important because military law enforcement, these are our symbols of what it means to be American. So they have to lead the way. They have the very tough responsibility of showing us what American safety, American security, American citizenship looks like. And there's even a lack of cultural ambassadorship there. So the answer to that, Jocelyn, is really integrating cultural literacy, not as one day or 1 month, but integrated within the system, integrated within the recognition and understanding and respect, so that when you meet a Black woman, she carries on her shoulders centuries of stories. When you meet a Hispanic man, he carries on his back centuries of oppression. And recognizing that and really honoring that, I think that is very important. The second thing is that there is a lack of promotion in the ranks. You have an inordinate amount of diversity, women and men, in the beginning ranks of every field. But by the time you move up, that is shrinking and shrinking, and the promotion and retention is shrinking to the point where only 1% of the Recording Academy voters is Asian. I'm part of that 1%. Whereas 72% of Asians are consuming music produced by American artists, only 1% can vote. 2% of diversity content reaches the Oscars. 4% of major universities and hospitals, top people are diversity. If you're talking about diversity women, that gets even lower. So if you're entering into a room of 100 executives who are policymakers, decision makers, and they're owning P&L, they own the funding, you meet one diversity person and one diversity woman. That's not a very good percentage. I mean, I'm supposed to be good at math, but even I can tell you that math sucks. So I think, you know, the answer to that is really increasing and elevating funding and awareness for cultural literacy.
And how do we move the needle on that? Because I feel like we're getting to a place where the awareness is happening, but then how do we move from awareness to action? Because it seems like these things take way more time than they should, and conversations are hard to have, or it's sometimes uncomfortable. So what do we do to move the needle, in your opinion?
You know, that's why agencies like the Mix and Titanium Worldwide and social media networks and the media are so important. Because of the pressure of the media, Illinois became the very first state to say, we're integrating Asian American history in all of our schools. They have to step forward and say, you have to have pressure from the media and pressure from social media and pressure from TikTok and all of that for people to move. There was another situation I heard from this forum today, that the first Black three-star general was appointed because Washington Post came out with this huge article 2 years ago that said he's tried for 4 times and he's never been assigned as a three-star general. I mean, it's egregious that we've never had a Black general. So finally, we have a Black general. And I think the media plays a huge role in collaborating with DEI and with inclusion. There's also some media who are against it. So it's a tidal wave that has to happen in order for the needle to move. Even the Stop Asian Hate movement started because the media jumped on board, and Black Lives Matter started because the media started to cover all of the parades and all of the voices that came together across the aisle. So collaborating with media is very important. Collaborating with leaders on top and having those behind the doors discussions of why this is key is important. And lastly, I just have to say, money is important. Money talks. Capital is important. If companies are not hiring, if they're not putting their money where their mouth is, if they're coming out saying, we're supporting diversity, here's $1 billion grant. Okay, that's great. Well, how is it being distributed? Like, who's distributing it? Are you distributing to your golf buddies? Like, this is not okay. Where is it? Like, we're saying that you're committing $1 billion over 4 years to help economically disadvantaged youths and families in Black communities. Where's the money? So we have to hold them accountable. So I think that is very important. And one of the questions that I asked early this morning was, how do we hold the military, for example, accountable? They seem like it's hard to hold accountable. Can we vote? Are we like shareholders and we can vote people out? And the answer was yes, you can absolutely vote. You can absolutely petition to fire a commander if there's been abuse, if there's been sexual harassment, and all of that. And I didn't know that. So I think that the country has a lot of power, and citizens have more power than we feel. So that's very important to get the message out there that we can make a difference if we come together.
I love that, because I think at times, especially in times like today, it can be hard to see how to move against the grain when we have things that are happening every single day. But understanding that us as individual human beings have the power to make a difference in our own right. And then that when we come together as small groups, and then those groups become smaller, and that we build up this snowball effect, there's huge change and impact, but it has to start with just one person, one voice. And so not to discount ourselves from being able to make that change and make that difference.
Absolutely, 100%. And you can be young, you can be old. I mean, look at that amazing little girl who stood up, was a Greta, about environmental change and global warming. And, you know, like a little girl can make a big difference. If a little girl can make a big difference, it can move the needle in some major policy. We all can. All can do our part. What happens, though, is that we get distracted. You know, we get distracted by all of the things that get thrown at us on purpose to distract us. We get distracted by our mortgage. We get distracted by the number of likes on our Facebook page. You know, we get distracted. And my mother used to say that her mom, my grandma, was the most confident woman on the planet because she never got distracted. She always stayed focused on making sure that women were treated well and equally, and they were given equal opportunity, even as some places sexist as Japan, that women were given a voice, and she stayed focused on that for her entire life. That was her advocacy, is that women have a right to speak. That generation then went to my mother, who was like, okay, women have a right to speak. Women also have a right to empower and to support ourselves financially, so, right? Because in the 50s, 60s, you could not even open a bank account if you didn't have your husband or your brother or your father with you in the United States. Then it came to our generation, you and me, which is, yes, women have a right to speak. We have a right to take care of ourselves and own a bank account and own property on our own. And we also have a right to be seen equitably with others. So equity, not equality, is really the focus now. Equality, we all have equality. Okay, we are all equal. We all have an equal vote. We all have equal rights to the bank account. We all are equal. And if there is no equality of that country club that we can't get into, we go and create our own. So we're like, okay, whatever, we go create our own. So we have equality now. We don't have equity. So equity out of DEI is really, really key. And I'm hoping that my children's generation will not have to worry about equity, that they can focus their attention on something like curing cancer and reversing global warming, and not this equity conversation. They don't have to deal with that. I'm hoping by my grandkids' generation, maybe, but equity is really key right now, and that's what everybody's focused on.
Yeah. So as we wrap, do you have any final words of wisdom for us?
Well, I do feel that what you are doing, Jocelyn, is so important, and keep doing it every day. And what Titanium and the Mix are doing and really bringing focus on DEI is so important, especially DEI for the AAPI community, and giving awareness and amplifying the narrative that the AAPI community has a very long history going all the way back, to centuries and centuries of inequity. But in terms of what I would feel as a word of wisdom is that there is a lot of power in cultural intelligence. Cultural intelligence is very easy to learn. It can be free while you're watching Netflix. Go on Wikipedia and just start strolling down and looking at, what does racial segregation mean? Who colonized Vietnam? Why is Thailand saved from imperialism? Like, what happened in Africa? What are the 4 cradles of civilization? Like, that's cultural intelligence. Cultural intelligence is understanding the customs, the history, and the achievements of a group. So it's really important. Start from your community. If you live in Tennessee, you live in New York, if you're from California, like, what is your community all about? There's culture in your community. There's culture in your city. There's culture in your county. Certain things divide you as a state from one to another. Certain things define you as a region. The South is different from the North. Why is that? So I think a lot of Americans would benefit greatly, and also just everyone would benefit greatly from cultural intelligence. And that is really, really key. I also feel that more and more it's important to understand that the highest good of any entity should be our greatest intent. It should be our sole intent. And if that's our sole intent, then nothing can take us down.
Oh, I love that. That is a great way to end.
The highest good should be our sole intent.
Well, that is our sole intent here. And thank you so much for joining me for this conversation.
Thank you so much, Jocelyn.
We'll talk to you soon.